Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 10 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Toronto Maple Leafs, in which the Sharks have won 4-3 in overtime. So the Sharks' third win of the season. Two of those have come post-regulation time, but they are 2 points all the same in the standings, and this game honestly felt very similar to games that we would have seen last year from the San Jose Sharks. It's not as though that the Sharks last year were some sort of amazing team, but in a lot of the games that they played, they managed to make it like somewhat interesting, and this game was indeed rather interesting. This was also the first game where the Sharks actually managed to score more than 2 goals on a manned net. They doubled that here tonight with 4 goals on a manned net, and generally played probably their best game of the season. Obviously, they had 2 previous wins against the Flyers and the Rangers, and the Rangers game was pretty good, strong third period to end that one off, and the Flyers game had good play from James Reimer as well as a decent start to it. But generally, I thought this was a really solid game against a team that many have expected to be one of the best in the entire league. In the first period, the Sharks started off immediately with a goal within the first 30 seconds of the game coming from Logan Couture on a newly crafted second line, which we will get to a bit later. But the Leafs would manage to tie up the game with a goal from Kampf near the end of the first period to bring it to a 1-1 tie after 20 minutes. In the second period, we would see a rare situation in which not only 1 but 2 penalties were called on the exact same shift. So this actually ended up leading to a 2-minute 5-on-3 power play for the San Jose Sharks, and they managed to capitalize on that with Couture's second of the game and his 300th of his career to give the Sharks the lead 2-1. But since it was a 5-on-3, the goal still left the Sharks on a 5-on-4 normal power play, and they added another that would end up being Timo Meier's first goal of the season. Finally gets off the schneid here 10 games into this season and gives the lead to the Sharks 3-1, but very late in the second period, it is Mitch Marner who gets the Leafs back onto the board here, 3-2, 1 goal difference, and with those late period goals, that always gives the team that's trailing and the team that scored that late period goal the momentum going into the next period. And so, especially against a strong offense like the Maple Leafs do have with some real elite talent, it was going to be difficult for the Sharks to hold the lead, and difficult it was. It was Austin Matthews, the Rocket Richard winner from last season, 60 goals scored there. He scores his second of the season to tie the game up at 3, and we would then head to overtime, but not for a lack of chances near the end of that third period. A lot of them, a couple for the San Jose Sharks, multiple for the Leafs. But Kaapo Kähkönen stands tall, and so the Sharks managed to at the very least secure 1 point. And then we go to the overtime, where the Sharks employ a very interesting strategy. So first, David Quinn starts on the ice with Nico Sturm, Logan Couture, as well as Mario Ferraro on the back end. And at first I thought, oh no, here we go again. This is like a page right out of the Bob Booner handbook of how to handle the overtime. You send in 2 Logan Couture is not necessarily a random player, but you usually expect Hertl, Meier, and Karlsson as a trio to really come on to start the overtime like they did against the Rangers. But it was actually an extremely interesting move that the Sharks started with 2 centermen. That's a big thing. 2 centermen on the ice just in case someone got kicked out of the face-off circle, and more defensively oriented players, so that if the Leafs got possession with players like Matthews and Marner, that you would maybe be able to defend a bit better. And once the Sharks got back possession within just like 20 or so seconds, they immediately swapped over to that first trio of Karlsson, Meier, and Hertl, and they would actually be the trio who would end up scoring. Karlsson, another amazing play in the overtime, gets the breakaway goal. Nice little interception by Timo Meier on William Nylander as well back in his own zone, and the Sharks would win the game. So I was hesitant with the start of this overtime call, but in the end it of course works out, and it's definitely a pretty interesting move to say the least. On to the lineups, there was some shakeup in the top 6. So on the first line it was still Meier and Hertl, but instead of Barabanov they were joined by Evgeny Svechnikov. Now this was a move that really screwed screamed to me that we're probably not going to see many of the younger players for the San Jose Sharks or for the San Jose Barracuda called up to the main roster, because this is like a desperation move that you make just because you're trying to do something. And if they're not going to actually bring up the young talent from the back end, I guess this is kind of what you have to do. And so Svechnikov, who has been relatively impressive in the bottom six thus far this season, gets a chance on the first line. And I will say it didn't really work out. I mean, he was there and he wasn't terrible, but he also didn't really do anything. But in the end, his two line mates, Hertl and Meier, really seemed to get something ignited here in this game. In the first period, where the Sharks were in probably their worst period of the game, you could definitely say. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't that great. Most of the chances, in fact, that the Sharks got in that first period came indeed from this Meier line. Meier had a beautiful pass to try and set up Erik Karlsson, who ended up missing the net. Then another great opportunity set up for this line for Erik Karlsson once again, and that time it got blocked by Mark Giordano in front. Generally, both Hertl and Meier really got back into the game here in this one, and Meier, of course, finally broke through with his first goal of the year, and so we will see exactly if they can carry that momentum forward. We also saw near the end of the game that Svechnikov got subbed off of this line in exchange for Kevin Labanc. It's still obviously not a great solution. You know, there are certain other players in the system that the Sharks could definitely try out to maybe greater success, but it seems as though they don't want to do that, like I said. So right now, unless Barabanov returns back to that first line, we might have a sort of a rotating cast of players here until someone can manage to fit for more than a couple games. On the second line, we got a complete change. So Barabanov was moved down to the line with Logan Couture, and Matt Nieto was jumped up from the fourth line to the second line. And surprisingly, this line worked out pretty well. Barabanov and Couture, ever since Barabanov has been with the San Jose Sharks, which has been a couple years now, he has played very, very rarely with Logan Couture at even strength. Most of the time, Barabanov is playing with Tomas Hertl, and as such, since Hertl and Couture are both centermen, they don't really see the ice a lot together, besides on the power play, and yet here we are now, and just immediately on the first shift, this line managed to score. Good work from Matt Nieto. Nice follow-up from Logan Couture. And generally, the second line probably had their best game in a while. How much of a long-term solution is this? Well, Barabanov still played very well. Potentially his best game of the season. Logan Couture, you could very well say the same thing about. And while Nieto was good, obviously, Nieto is not really a second-line player at all. We have seen this type of experiment be done last season by Bob Booner, and while it had a couple of decent games then, it obviously didn't end up being anything long-term. That's going to be the exact same case here tonight as well. And so generally, we take a look at what the Sharks were running as a top six for this game, and you have Svechnikov and Matt Nieto both sticking out like sore thumbs in the top six as players who just cannot be there if you want to win any amount of games consistently, but it worked out here tonight. On the third line, Sturm was joined by Lindblom and Cunnin. Sturm, I thought, still pretty solid game for himself. Lindblom definitely also looked a good bit better. Still nothing super impressive, but at the very least it was an improvement over the past few games. Meanwhile, when it comes to Cunnin, he has obviously seen a fall from grace. Started the season on the first line with Meier and Hertl. And that didn't really work out. It wasn't terrible, but it didn't really work out. Then he moved to the second line with Couture, and that was an absolute disaster for a few games. Now he finds himself on the third line. We'll see if that's sort of the rock bottom for him, but it wasn't necessarily a super great game for Cunnin, having said that. Meanwhile, the fourth line, it did pretty much nothing, which is why I said this was also a pretty similar game to the San Jose Sharks that we saw from last season. The first line was amazing, and the fourth line was more or less invisible. I barely even recognized that Gadjevich was even dressed for this game, considering he was scratched for the previous few of them, so that kind of says the whole story. On the defensive side of things, I've talked a lot about Erik Karlsson, and I will continue to do so now with 3 points here tonight, including that marvelous overtime winner for himself. 3 points there puts him at 9 on the season in 10 games, leads the way for the San Jose Sharks. Clearly, on the offensive side of things, Erik Karlsson is really doing a lot thus far for the San Jose Sharks, carrying pretty much the brunt of the offense from that back end, which is no surprise since nobody else is really going to be able to step up at that point. So he's really trying to fill into the shoes left by Brent Burns, and he's actually been doing a pretty solid job of that over these past few games. The defense still can leave a bit to be desired, though of course we did see him make the hip check play, which was very Brent Burns-esque, onto Mitch Marner after he lost his stick, which was extremely surprising to see, but also very nice to see, even if it only does happen because he doesn't have his stick in that situation. So generally, a very solid game for Karlsson. Did get into a bit of penalty trouble, a couple of penalties taken late in the third period, but still obviously more than made up with it for his 3-point night. But I also want to talk about his partner as of late over these past few games, besides that one random game where Scott Harrington drew into the lineup for absolutely no reason for a disastrous performance. That would be Jacob Megnar, who I thought actually played rather well for the San Jose Sharks last season in the games that he did get. Solidly a defensive player for the San Jose Sharks. At the start of this year, I thought Megnar was struggling a bit out the gate with a few pretty bad games, but as of late, over these past couple of games with Erik Karlsson at his side, has been playing rather well. Did a pretty decent job shutting down some of the top Toronto Maple Leafs players here tonight, and so commendations do have to go towards him. The rest of the defensive core I thought looked pretty decent. Ferraro I thought actually stood out pretty well here tonight. I thought he made a couple of really solid plays and passes, and Matt Benning wasn't as much of a disaster as he usually is, which I guess is a compliment. So there's that. And then finally, on the goaltending side of things, Kähkönen had a pretty up and down game, I would say. A couple of these goals you could say, well, the Kampf one he probably could have had. He didn't really have much of a chance on the Marner one. The Matthews one was from far out, but it is a shot from the Rocket Richard winner from last season, so it is of course pretty difficult to save. You could just ask 60 goaltenders last season how difficult a Matthews shot is to save. And then of course Kähkönen had those heroics down the stretch in the third period. It was, the Leafs could have definitely had a couple of goals. One particular was like a save of the week type of moment there in the third period. So he was the player who kept the Sharks at a tie game down the stretch in the third period and got them into the overtime where they managed to get the win. So generally, it was a pretty good game from Kähkönen. I can't put it at the great level because of the couple of hesitations earlier on, but still solid game. That will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on the Tampa Bay Lightning, Stanley Cup finalists from last year, Stanley Cup winners from the 2 previous years. So even though they haven't looked that great thus far this season, can never take them too lightly. And we'll see if the Sharks can finally string together some sort of winning streak for themselves, as they have now won 1 in a row. Class dismissed.